Have you ever gone to the fabric store needing material for 1 or 2 projects and left with enough for 5? Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and that is exactly what happened to me the other month. I had gone to the store because I needed material for a couple of projects, and as I was walking around, on the end of one of the aisles was a display of novelty fabric that happened to mostly have prints that I really liked and that were related to a lot of my hobbies. And it took me about 10 seconds to decide that I wanted to make a quilt. Now, my original plan was to get the 2 prints that I sold that day and then to accumulate some more slowly over time as I found what I wanted. But as I walked around the store to finish getting what was on my list, I actually ended up buying all of the printed fabrics that I needed that day. So here's all of the fabric. I did have to go back to get like the solids and everything once I definitely knew exactly what I wanted to do. But this is the project that I am starting today. So before I get started, I do want to talk a little about my design. When I bought the fabric, I didn't really have a plan. And so when I went home, I had to look up different quilt top patterns and designs. I wanted something with larger squares just because since these are novelty prints, I wanted something large enough to really show them off. And the one that I took a lot of inspiration from, I will put that pattern on screen. I'm not doing it exactly like it, but I did like kind of the style of it. So after I had decided roughly what I wanted to do, I sat down and kind of sketched it out on paper. So you can see here, I have the larger squares and they're all numbered, and that is to represent each print that they would be. So that would be the larger squares will all be the printed fabric. So will these small squares here. And then the strips in between would be white fabric. And then after all of these squares, I am going to do a border, which I didn't add here, that will go around all of the edges. Actually 2 borders because there will be 2 different colors. So basically this here is my list of all of the squares and sizes that I need for each of the prints, and that's what I'm going to start on next. Before I started cutting the fabric out, I did take the time to organize the prints according to like what order I wanted them in, basically looking to see like what did they look good next to, even though there would be the white strips between all of them. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, nothing looked glaringly out of place. After I had assigned numbers to all of the fabric prints, I started cutting them out, starting with number 1, which was this blue fabric with a sewing print on it. I had actually also used this fabric for a skirt to a dress. So some of the fabric that I'm cutting out here is scraps from that before I started in on the actual yardage that was left. And I am cutting several 6-inch and 3-inch squares here. Fabric number 2 was a purple fabric with white ballet silhouettes on it. This is the only fabric that I didn't find in the store, so I had to order it online, but it's really pretty, so I'm not going to complain about it. Now, for all of the fabric except for the last one, I got half a yard, so that's 18 inches tall and then 45 inches wide. And typically what I see called for in most quilting patterns is for the fabric to be cut the full width of the fabric. So like if I need a 6-inch square and a lot of them, I would cut a strip of fabric 6 inches tall and the full width of the fabric. And then I would cut that at 6-inch increments until I'd used it all up. Instead, what I'm doing here is I am measuring actually 6 inches over from the selvage edge and cutting that. So that gives me a 6 by 18 inch piece of fabric. And then I cut that 18-inch piece into 3 pieces, giving me 3 6-inch squares. And one of the main reasons that I'm doing this that way instead of cutting the full width of the fabric is because I knew that I didn't necessarily need all of the fabric. So this just left me with a better shaped piece of fabric for future use. Fabric number 3 was this bright turquoise baking print fabric, and this is the one that was sitting on the end of the shelf right next to the sewing fabric that kind of started this whole project because I looked at it and I really liked it, but unlike the sewing fabric, I just couldn't see myself using it in a dress or as a skirt or pretty much for anything else. So that's where kind of the whole idea for this project came from. It is also definitely the brightest colored fabric as far as the background goes. And this is where I started running into some problems with the cutting plan that I had. So I mentioned a minute ago, I got half yard of all of these prints, and I should have been able to get 3 squares across the height of the fabric. With this fabric, and I think a couple of the other ones, I started having the problem where certain spots, yes, I could get all 3 in that height. But there were a few spots that were just a little too short for that, whether it was because of crooked edges and trying to even things out, or just because of how it was cut. It was just a little too short. So I was only getting 2 up and then a couple of my 3-inch squares out of the size of the fabric in a few spots. Now thankfully I did have enough extra that wasn't a problem. The 4th fabric had books printed on it, and unlike the rest of the fabrics that I used, which were typical quilting fabrics, this was flannel. However, it didn't look like most flannels. It was more smooth and less fuzzy, so I figured it would fit in pretty well. Print number 5 was what I call the cooking fabric, and it had pots and pans and different things on it, but the background of it is this kind of green that was definitely an outlier compared to the rest of the fabric backgrounds, and it didn't match as well, so I had to be a little more particular about where I put it in the overall order of pieces. Now this one was the worst one to cut out because it was just so crooked. What can sometimes happen is the fabric can get off grain. So if your fabric is typically the selvage edges of on either side and the fabric is on a bolt, those selvage edges are folded together. Now if everything is on grain, then as you go across, there should be like no wrinkles towards that fold, and those selvage edges should line up. But what happens sometimes is that it gets crooked. While the cut edges are all even, they're not straight. So you can have 18 inches, yes, on all spots, but that 18 inches can start high on one end and low on the other end. And of course it's folded in half, so then it's most of the time high on the outer edges and like dips on the fold or in the center of your fabric. Number 6 was this purple fabric with dresses on mannequins printed on it. I think I got this one just because it was kind of another sewing related fabric. And this one was actually easier to cut out because it had evidently been cut just like an inch or 2 bigger than the 18 inches that I had requested. So gave me a little extra room to get it cut out properly and made it easier to straighten out those crooked edges. And the last fabric was this teal fabric. I think it's actually by Singer, and it was a farm animal print, which I thought was really pretty, and we do have a lot of farm animals around here, so it seemed appropriate. I had to cut the strips of white fabric that would go in between all of the squares, and these were going to be 6 by 3 inches. And since I knew I had bought more fabric than I needed, and the fabric was actually pretty straight on this one, I did go ahead and cut the full width of the fabric at 6 inches tall, and then cut that into 3-inch strips all the way across, and then just repeated a lot until I had all that I needed. One thing to note though is that I did decide later on to switch 2 of the prints around, and that was, I believe it was 6 and 7. So it was the farm print and the purple mannequin print, and that was just because I felt like the farm print helped make the cooking print look a little less like it didn't belong, because those 2 colors were a bit closer together, so they looked better together. So next I began pinning all of the pieces together. I decided to sort of organize everything into a block of sorts, and my blocks were 1 large square with a strip of fabric next to it, and then underneath it would be a white strip of fabric and a small square. At this point, I decided to just sew everything according to the blocks, and I did number these blocks based on the print of the large square, if that makes sense. Now before I did that, I did have to pull some of the large squares that were going to be on the far right edge of the quilt. And that's because on that edge, they are only partial squares. So for all of the squares that I pulled, they needed a strip of white fabric sewn under them, but not to the side of them. And they did not have any small squares associated with them. So for the actual sewing, I like to batch sew things, so I will just keep putting one piece on after the other without cutting in between. I find that this saves time and thread. But I did have these organized again according to blocks, so after I sewed all the pieces for block 1, I would sew the first piece of block 2, and then I would clip block 1 off and set it aside. That way it kind of just helped keep all of the blocks organized. After all of the pieces were sewn, I pressed the seam allowances. Now I am used to pressing my seams open, but the quilting channel that I had been watching, I noticed she always pressed them either to one side or the other. So I chose to press to the side, always as much as possible, toward the side that was the printed fabric, since the white fabric was a bit thin. So to finish the blocks, I need to attach the upper piece of it to that lower strip. And I did pin all of these pieces before I sewed them. And when I was pinning them, I was also double checking the size of things, because with some of the pieces in particular, it was really obvious that along the seam that had already been sewn, there was a difference in size. So one would be shorter than the other. And I needed to determine if that was because one piece had been cut too big or because one had been cut too small. So I just did a lot of measuring. A few of them I think were a bit too tall, and so I was able to trim them down. If they were too small, basically what I had to do was just kind of offset the piece. So instead of lining up the raw edges together like I would normally do, you know, the piece that it was being attached to would just have to stick out a little. And as long as it wasn't more than 1/4 of an inch off, it wasn't a big deal. I'd just have a bit of a smaller seam allowance on that piece. And as I did this, I also realized that the bottom row would also be a partial row, only unlike the far right column, these blocks only needed the white strip sewn next to it and did not have anything sewn under it. So actually all of these pieces were already done, and they just had to be set aside and labeled as my bottom row. And sewing the seam was just like the last one, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and afterwards I went to press them, and this time I did have to decide, was I going to press the seam allowance up or down? In both cases, at least part of the seam allowance was going to be on the white fabric, which wasn't ideal, but I decided to press them up because that put the majority of the seam allowance behind the large printed fabric. Once the blocks were finished, I was ready to sew them into rows. So I took my drawing from earlier and used that to lay out each of the rows. And each row had 8 blocks. So then I pinned each of the blocks to the one next to it, which gave me 4 different pieces to sew. I sewed those together, and then I pinned those 4 pieces together again to the ones next to it, and sew those together, giving me 2 pieces. Then I sewed those 2 pieces together right down the middle to make one long row. And I did that for each row, and I did kind of do it all at once, but that's kind of the breakdown of what was going on for each row. And once all the blocks were sewn into rows and the seam allowances were pressed, I then sewed all of the rows together in a similar manner. So each row sewn to the one next to it, and then each group of 2 rows sewn to the one next to it, until I had one big panel. Once the panel was done, I measured the edges to figure out how much I needed for a border. Now my border was going to be 2 colors. I had this turquoise and then this purple, and I cut both into 3-inch strips. Then I sewed all the strips for each color together using an angled seam like I would for bias or quilt binding, because I was trying to get it to look like these were all one long strip. Then I sewed the blue and purple strips together along the long edge, and I cut the border to the size of the edges. So I cut to the measurement of the long edge and to the measurement of the short edge. Then I took the 2 border pieces that were cut to the length of the long side of the panel and sewed them on. And when I got to the end of those, I realized that I had actually mismeasured somewhere along the way and that my pieces were too short. So what I did to remedy that was I stopped with sewing the border just a little before I ran out of border piece. And then I took some of the extra border that I had left over and I just sewed it onto the strip that was already attached to the panel, and then went back and finished attaching it to the panel and trimmed off the excess. Now for the borders, the turquoise is on the inside, and what I wanted to make it look like was as if each strip of the turquoise that was framing the panel was independent strips, and that they were kind of overlapping and going past the purple strips, if that makes sense. If not, hopefully you'll see what I mean at the end. And what you need to know now is that I needed to make squares to go in all of the corners before I can sew on the short border edge. So to make these corner squares, for each one I cut a 3 by 3 inch square of both purple and blue fabric and sewed them together. I then sewed a blue strip of fabric to that long side of those 2 pieces that were sewn together, almost like the beginning of a log cabin block. And I made 4 of these, 1 for each corner. I then took one of these squares and attached it to one end of the short border. I then began attaching the short border to the panel, starting at the end with the square and working my way across. This border was also too short, so I had to do much the same as the last one. Seam another piece on, trim it down, and then add the remaining square on the end. Believe it or not, that was the easy part, and it's all downhill from there. So the next part was assembling the quilt, which started by laying out the backing. Then I added the batting on top of the backing, and I just bought one of those like pre-measured, pre-cut pieces. And then I added the quilt top on top of that, and this is when I discovered that I had probably made my quilt top a little too big. And that's because it was practically the same size and maybe even a slightly bit bigger than my batting. And that's not ideal. I mentioned this the last time I did a baby quilt because it just doesn't allow any room for shifting things. And it did make things a little difficult later on as we went, but I got everything laid out as best I could. And then it was time to baste things together. Now the last time I did a quilt, I only basted around the raw edges because that's all I thought I was supposed to do. But since then I have researched it a little more, and it turns out that really with quilting you need something holding it together as much as possible, basically across the whole thing. And that's just to keep things from shifting around. Options for that include like a spray based, which you just spray on and press everything out, and safety pins. I don't have any of the spray based, so I wasn't going to do that. And as for safety pins, I have them, but they're all really small, so I didn't think they would be very effective. So I chose to pin baste mine and just use regular sewing pins. I did this basically by starting along one edge and going across, and then continuing across and up as far as I could reach. Once I reached the point where I couldn't reach anymore, I would roll up the parts that had already been pinned and then continue. Once everything was pinned in place, I unrolled it and trimmed down the excess of the backing fabric. I didn't trim it down like all the way to the quilt top because I did want to leave room for in case things shifted and all of that. And before I started quilting all of these layers together, I did rearrange my sewing room a bit. So I moved the desk that typically my sewing machine sits on and pushed it up against the cutting table, which is already 2 tables pushed together. And then I put my sewing machine on it. And that was just in hopes that having the extra table space would help support the weight of the quilt as I was working. For quilting all of these layers together, I chose to do it along the seams of the quilt top. And to make things more manageable, I started by going vertically and at the centermost vertical seam. And I rolled the edges towards that seam just to make everything more manageable. So on the one side so that it would fit underneath my sewing machine, and on the other side just so I didn't have everything hanging off the edge of my table. So I went to the sewing machine and just sewed along that seam. I did it slightly next to the seam, not like right in the seam. And then I would take it off and I would unroll the one side to the next seam and roll up the other side a little bit closer to it, and repeated until I got to the edge of that side. And as I was doing this, I was only doing this over the parts where the blocks were, and nothing was being sewn onto the border at this point. So after I did that from the center to the edge of one side, I then had to go back to the center and work my way to the other edge. After all of the vertical quilting was done, I then started to do the same thing going horizontally. And this is where things started getting a little messy. It seems that when I was quilting vertically, I was not pulling everything tight enough, and so there was some slack. And what that caused was that as I was sewing across those seams, the fabric kind of was puckering, so it was too loose, and the fabric had nowhere to go when it hits the next line of quilting, so it would just kind of pucker or pleat right there at that line. Now the good thing about this was that since I had done all of my quilting along seams, at least where it was puckering was also where a seam was, so to me it maybe felt a little less obvious. After I finished the main part of the quilt, I went back and quilted the border. And for that, I just did a straight line on either edge of the blue strips. Again, trying to emphasize this idea of each strip is kind of an independent piece that is weaving in and out of the other pieces. And I also went along and basted the raw edges down as well. Now this was really easy on the long edges because they were, again, the vertical edges that quilted fairly well. But going on the short edges, which would have been the horizontal edges, which had all of that puckering earlier, well, the puckering continued through to the edges, which makes sense, but did make it a lot harder to get it basted down. I actually ended up doing it by hand because when I was doing it on the machine, it was really pushing all the loose fabric towards one end and causing that whole edge to look kind of crooked. And at this point I was a bit frustrated, but it was the weekend, so I kind of took mostly a break and spent it mainly doing things like trimming off threads and things. So by the time I came back, I was hopeful that the rest of this would go pretty easily. Yeah, I was wrong about that. So I started out by doing the final trim on all of the edges so that everything lined up with the edge of the quilt top. Then I cut out my binding pieces. I chose to use the same fabric that I used for the backing for my binding. So I cut all those pieces out, sewed them together, and pressed them in half. And for the binding, I did use the same tutorial that I used in the baby quilt video. And the last time I did this, I really enjoyed it. I don't know what happened this time because this time it was a complete nightmare. So part of the problem I do know was just the size of this quilt compared to a baby quilt. It's a lot more cumbersome to work with a larger piece like this. And unlike when I was doing the quilting earlier, I couldn't roll up one side because I needed access to all four sides. So I couldn't just roll it up to keep it on the table, which meant that the entire time I was attaching the binding to the quilt, the weight of the quilt was pulling things crooked. So I was basically fighting gravity the entire way. The second thing that happened was the corners. Now, when you get to the corner with the method that I was using, you're supposed to stop partway from the edge and then turn it and kind of sew out towards the point of the corner. Every time I did this, my thread seemed to jam or get caught somehow, and I would have to clip the thread, rethread my needle, and restart. And what would happen is I wouldn't get those stitches in that was supposed to help the binding to fold back the way that it was supposed to when turning that corner. So as a result, when I moved on to the next step, which was folding the binding over the raw edge and around to the other side and sewing it down, I discovered that instead of nice neat corners like I was supposed to have, I had messy kind of curved corners. And again, even for that second step of folding everything over and sewing it the second time, I still couldn't roll everything up. I was still fighting gravity. It just was not enjoyable at all. But at least the quilt was finally done. There are a few things that I don't like about how this turned out. I think the white fabric that's in between the squares looks a little off. Like maybe it should have been a different color, but also I don't know what color I would have done instead. And the border, I don't know, it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, though I'm sure the fact that it looks so wrinkled is factoring into that. And that comes from the puckering, which was obviously a big problem just overall, but I feel like it's not as noticeable anywhere else other than the border. And it's not that I think it's bad or anything, it's just that these are things that I've noticed probably from having spent so much time looking at it so closely. I am glad to be done with this project. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will join me next time for another handmade happening.